Hey everybody, a warm welcome to the Business in Heels Gender in the Workplace conversation. So congratulations for making the decision to join us. It's going to be a fabulous conversation today. Rarely discussed but powerful communication biases perpetuate gender inequality in many workplaces. For example, why is one person described as aggressive by some and assertive by others? And how do these biases impact their ability to deliver? We'll be discussing this topic amongst others with an aim to give you the tools and ideas on how you can improve your workplace. We'll be exploring this with our gender equity advocates, Ali Wastie, Jeremy Crawford, Brett Winter, and Anne O'Loughlin. Singers, we can't have a real audience, we have to fake it. But let's begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we join today's meeting. For me, it's the Wathaurong people. Can I ask any of you to add yours into the chat? And on our behalf, I pay my respects to the elders, past, present and future. And in the spirit of reconciliation, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the country throughout Australia, their connections to the land, sea and community, and I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. We extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So welcome. So why are we doing these webinars? Well, many of you would know we run the Gender Equity Awards for Australia, and we're lucky enough to learn about best practice. And a little reminder that the entries are closing Wednesday of next week on the 31st of July. So if you happen to know any employees or companies that are deserving, then please nominate them. I promise it's easy and it will make their day. So let's kick off. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Ali Wastie, who's the CEO of the City of Greater Geelong, who leads a diverse and dynamic organisation that serves over 250,000 residents and business, one of Australia's fastest growing regions. Now, with over 20 years of experience in senior leadership roles across public and private sectors, Ali, we're just delighted to have you here. Can you share with us briefly why you're so passionate about gender equity? And maybe give us a sneak peek on anything that you're working on.
Sure. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this seminar. I'm absolutely delighted to be here with yourself, Brett, Jeremy and Anne. I think that gender equity is the last unfinished business of our generation. And I'm an optimist, so I am hoping that it will be finished in my lifetime, but probably the statistics are telling us otherwise. But as I hold a position of leadership and opportunity to influence and shape a large organisation that does serve over 230,000 residents of the City of Greater Geelong and very much growing, I do see it as a responsibility on myself as a leader and also the organisation to lead by example, being a public sector agency as well. So there's lots of things that we can do and we are doing at the city to close any gender gap that exists and it certainly still does exist, and also show best practice, not only to other public sector organisations, but community and also the private sector. So there's lots of things that we are doing and working on the city. So first of all, our own organisation, we're 2,850 employees and we're still very much a gendered workforce. So for example, in our aged and disability services, family, youth and children's services, most of our employees are female. In our depots, for example, where parks and gardens, the outdoor crew, if you like, most are male. And we're putting in deliberate structures and policies and programs to break down those gender norms and really supporting women and also men to go into those sort of non-traditional roles. We also track really important things like pay. So pay in terms across the whole, from our banded employees right up to executive, in terms of to make sure that there is no pay gap. And I'm really pleased to report that at the City of Greater Geelong, we've made great strides in addressing that pay gap. What we have, though, is inherent structures here in Australia. So being a gendered workforce, we know that some of our lowest paid people in society in general come from caring backgrounds, Asian disability services, childcare, and of course they are feminised. So we're really looking into them. Whilst it's legislated now, we at the City of Greater Geelong and all local government authorities and also public sector agencies in Victoria have to have gender equity and action plans. We don't do this because we have to. We do it because it's the right thing to do. So in everything we do, we put a gender lens across it. So that includes really understanding, for example, in the city, we have lots of sports facilities. Our community is absolutely sports mad, but many of our sports facilities were built in the 50s, 60s and 70s, where females were not participating as much as they are now, and certainly in sports such as football. So we're taking a really proactive approach to make sure that our facilities are also fit for purpose, and that means all members of our community, so that they can feel safe, they can feel welcomed, and that we have an inclusive approach. So that's just a few things that we're doing at the city, Lisa.
Wow, that sounds like you're pretty busy already. So moving on to our next guest is Brett Winter. He's the CEO of Geelong Port and a director of G21. Brett leads Victoria's largest pure bulk port and is responsible for setting overall business strategy to support infrastructure development and the safe and efficient handling of more than 11 million tonnes of product annually. Wow, it's a big number, right? So welcome, Brett. Brett, can you share with us briefly why you're so passionate about gender equity?
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, for that lovely introduction. So, we know there's a lot of barriers to gender equality that exist in organisations. Things like workplace culture, gender stereotypes, the societal expectations, a lack of flexible working practices that tend to fuel that inequality. And so for us, equity is about, or achieving equity is about the process that you have to go through to actually address that. Now at Geelong Port, we see gender equity as a strategic imperative because ultimately we want to build an organisation that's adaptable, that's performance focused, and that's able to deliver on those objectives. And we recognise that we simply can't do that with those barriers in place because ultimately they affect all aspects of our performance and they impact our capability, specifically our ability to actually change as well, there's been some really interesting studies on that from a DEI perspective. And most importantly, the ability to actually attract and retain key talent. Now, being in the maritime industry, it is very much male dominated. When I first started at Port, we were 98% male as far as our workforce is concerned. And that's a traditional structure that's been in place, as you'd expect from an industry standpoint, for many, many decades, indeed hundreds of years in that regard. And the challenges that come with that from a cultural perspective, but also from a performance perspective, are actually quite profound. So from our point of view, we've got a really pragmatic rationale around why we actually need to ensure that we're actually taking tangible steps to remove those barriers. And it is really linked to what is a pretty ambitious growth strategy that we've got on foot. Beyond that, and really to echo, I guess, Ali's comments in relation to, more of an ethical obligation, similarly, we do see ourselves as a leader within the local community as well. And we see that obligation, we take that quite seriously as far as making sure that we're actually taking real steps, making real changes to our organisation to model really what the community expects from us. And we want to be a good role model. We want to set a good example, and from our perspective, we've put in place a diversity, equity and inclusion roadmap. And there's a range of different changes we've made, particularly around policy that are really targeted towards those barriers that I mentioned earlier. Things like working on developing a more constructive leadership style, getting more women into senior leadership positions in our organisation, addressing the gender pay gap, which I think, the last report was nationally, the meeting was about 21%. So currently we're running at about 3% at Geelong Port. Still some work to do in that regard, but certainly we're on the right path. And things like changing a lot of those policies that really inhibit greater workforce participation, whether that be flexibility, whether that be parental leave matters or care leave matters, because often a lot of the focus is on very much, women in terms of their leave. But if we focus more on providing leave opportunities for men in that scenario, then that opens up some changes, particularly in the way that we're operating at home, which can be really helpful as well. So from our point of view, we do see it as a strategic imperative. We want to make sure that we've got the right kind of organisation that's adaptable, that's focused on gender equity, because we do see it as a real advantage as far as our competition is concerned as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for sharing that, Brett. I think, ports would probably be one of the last bastions of, massive change required. So interesting. Our next panellist is Anne O'Loughlin. She's the Managing Principal of Culture Legal, who have won the Gender Equity Award for SMEs for 2 years in a row. So Anne needs no introduction. Welcome, Anne. Do you want to share with us briefly why you're so passionate about gender equity?
Thanks, Lisa. I think without passion, and I certainly have passion in this space, we'll just rest on our laurels, and we'll, for us, we've worked on parental leave, flexibility, and I take note there of that flexibility, not around just women, but also men, and I'm sure we'll explore that a little bit later on. I too am in a privileged position, like Ali, Brett and Jeremy, to be a leader at Culture Legal, but as part of being a leader, we need to be collaborative, because if we don't get everybody's input about what we need as a firm or a business, then we won't make inroads that we've made in the gender equity space over a number of years. I mean, historically, women and gender diverse people have not been at the same starting point as men have been, and we've moved so significantly in so many ways, but there is still a long way to go. And I think for us, we're always looking at why, as I said, not sitting back and resting on our laurels, but looking at how we can achieve gender equity. We are a firm with, I think, about 80% women. So we're sort of very much slanted to women. And we also have 75% of our leadership team are also women. But we need to keep working on ensuring that we keep moving forward and in achieving gender equity. I think, Brett, you just talked about, we've introduced an IDE committee. I did that about maybe 3 months ago. So inclusion, diversity and equity. I was blown away by the interest. We had about, I think, 15 people want to come on the committee out of our 85. We also did a survey, and what also blew me away was that 55 of those people of our team filled in the survey and gave us very extensive responses. And some of the responses were surprising, and we're going to roll those out, because we know now where we can improve, and we need to improve around the gender diverse space, the neurodiverse space, and not just simply looking at men and women. So I am very passionate, and I'll continue to be passionate, because I think we've got so much more to do in this space, despite the fact of moving significantly away from historically where we were at with gender equity.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, for a law firm, law as an industry is a little bit behind the average, which, and I think some of your notable achievements were promoting partners who were part-time and whilst they were on parental leave. So it didn't, being on parental leave didn't stop their career at all. So that's... And
we do hear horror stories, particularly from women who had to leave their roles years ago because, if there was that glass ceiling was certainly there, and they couldn't progress, especially if they had children. Achieving a role as a principal in a firm was sometimes non-existent, which is certainly not the case now, or certainly not the case at Culture Legal.
Exactly. I have to say, unfortunately, it still is the case in some of law. Anyway, moving along, I'd also like to have a warm welcome to Jeremy Crawford, who's the CEO of the Geelong Chamber of Commerce. Prior to joining the Chamber, Jeremy has a history of talent acquisition and training. He's someone who's been a long-term gender advocate, and he's a judge for the awards this year. So welcome, Jeremy. And please share with us why you're so passionate about gender equity.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa. I think I have a slightly late coming to being an advocate for gender equity, but that's because I spent the first half of my career in, I would call them female friendly and sometimes female dominated industries. So early careers in hospitality, hotels, major events, and even recruitment to some degree have all traditionally had very, very strong female participation and also female leadership. So it wasn't until I had been in other positions and exposed to other industries that I realized there are certainly a large number of sectors and pockets that don't have that same privilege or culture or structure to it, along with a few personal examples, which we may uncover in some of the future discussions, which just really did not sit particularly well with me. So in my current role, we play a very strong leadership and community drive towards supporting all types of businesses. But the reality is that at the moment, about 40% of Australia's small to medium enterprises are owned or operated by females. So there's still a large gap. And when you consider the volume of business, SMEs represent about 97% of all Australian businesses. So there's quite a bit of work to do in that small and medium business ownership space. But as a community leader, there's absolutely a role for myself and for the Chamber to play, to be building support at all levels, from entrepreneurship through to part-time business ownership, which is becoming more prevalent now, where you can own and operate a business and not have to do exorbitant hours and days of work. And how do we support that across some of our business community? In the larger businesses, the shift in being able to work to activity or outcome-based performance, I think, has been a really good, positive game changer, where you are measured on your output as opposed to measured on how many additional hours or your commitment, and sometimes the relentless pursuit of putting family and lifestyle aside. I've been in some really fortunate workplaces where I've been able to live and breathe some of that responsibility and share some of the home and the child duties, etc. And would only want that to be equally available for anybody, no matter what their background and their situation is. So we'll continue as a business organisation to champion a lot of those elements that they're sometimes difficult for businesses and for organisations to shift that type of culture. But there's absolutely a role to play to bring in some positive experiences as well as tackling some of the challenges.
Awesome. And I think we have a lovely scene set now for a great discussion. So thank you all. So let's explore an example of communication bias. To set the scene, it covers numerous different interactions that happen both in business and society. The behaviours range from interruption patterns, speaking time, contributions in meetings, assumptions that are often based on parental status or encouragement bias, just to name a few. So what we plan to do is discuss each scenario and explore different ways our panellists might handle this. So let's just start off talking about recruitment bias. Now, Brett, you said you have an experience that you can share with us. Would you like to share the story?
I certainly can. So the story from my perspective is that I was involved in a recruiting process for an incredibly senior and key role in the organisation, and essentially it was for a project-based, construction-based role, a real senior management position. We'd gone through all the usual steps that you expect. As part of that, though, I had to present back to a final committee in relation to that, my recommendation for the hire, and I had put forward a woman in that regard, which, you know, in many ways these days is much more common, which is good, but certainly still in the construction industry, I still think there's a decent way to go as far as the senior positions are concerned. Now, when I put that person forward, they'd gone through a process, they'd been interviewed live, And then obviously afterwards I sat down with the steerco to go through that recommendation, and I was quite surprised that they'd actually unanimously rejected the proposal. And in actually working through that and trying to understand what the rationale for that was, a lot of the feedback I received was around, well, look, we're looking for someone that's a really sort of, a strong, tough person who can work in a really robust environment, because construction's really hard, it's tough, there's a lot of gruff people involved in there. And so a lot of the language around the feedback was around this, sort of masculine style description. Now, apart from sort of being flawed in that particular moment, and sort of attempting to maneuver through that, moving on from that, I sort of reflected upon how that came about. Now, this particular committee was really lacking diversity. It was all male, all senior male. And I really hadn't done my homework in preparing for that and putting forward my recommendation. There was certainly pretty significant unconscious bias in play during that review. And again, it's all about the language that gets used in recruitment. That's usually the main sort of repeating factor that I've seen in my career as far as where these issues arise. And so in this particular environment, we ended up essentially missing out on what I saw was key talent. That person, funnily enough, whilst they didn't get that role, they ended up going on and actually winning some awards in some other areas for some work that they did later on. So perhaps it was a blessing for them that they didn't quite get that particular role. But when I look at it, again, it's about the process design and what we took through, and just I guess these inherent biases that exist in recruitment, particularly around the industries that are already male dominated. And so we didn't have a great experience there on that front. From my perspective, when I did reflect on that, it seems obvious in hindsight. It's like, well, surely you would have prepared for this unconscious bias. You know what the panel is, you know what you're going for. But there was a degree of naivety in terms of how I thought about that, and really sticking to what I thought the key elements of the role were, which was around management, commercial acumen, ability to work with stakeholders, ability to manage deadlines, all those things that I saw in the role essentially wasn't being translated to the committee. So not a great experience to share, but a really good learning experience for me in terms of how I approach those things moving forward.
Great, and thank you for sharing that, Brett. And I think, this is now a good opportunity. Ali, what are your thoughts on that situation?
Well, I think there's some things that you can put in place, and we certainly do at the city, especially for our when we go out and use an external recruitment firm, for example, for some of our senior roles. We ensure that there's recruitment processes in place so that gender is not revealed, names are not revealed, because that can sometimes, give thought to where that person's nationality or where their background is from. So all you're getting is the resume. Admittedly, sometimes with the detail of the resume, you can determine how old they might be. So there's a potential for that creep to be in, but at least we're getting at the first cut through interview, where it's what we call sort of blind recruitment, which is probably a terrible term in itself. But we also make sure that we've got that diversity of panel too, but we can still do better. So our diversity at the moment at the city extends to just gender diversity, but we must endeavour to do better on that as well, just so it's all forms of diversity. But that is all. We also track as well. So we absolutely measure each year how we're going in terms of the recruitment, who's coming into the organisation, what levels they're at. So I'm really pleased to be able to say that we've actually got more women in positions of leadership at the City of Greater Geelong than we do men. I'm also pleased to say that we've got a significant uptick in men who are taking parental leave, and we've also structured it so it is more attractive for men to take parental leave at the second part of when they have a child or adopt a child. So that means it's more likely that they're going to extend their time, and for in most circumstances, their female partner, to go back to work. So we take out the financial reason as much as we can for people to stay at home. So that's some of the things that we do around the recruitment table, but I cannot stress how important it is to have targets and hold yourselves and the organisation accountable to those targets, and to see that positive change and trend year on year.
Well, thanks, Ali, and some really great initiatives in there. Jeremy, what are your thoughts, given your recruitment background?
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. And I suppose I've seen this from two different angles. One is half of my career in talent was in recruitment firms, and the other half was in-house with a large corporate. So it really is about finding the commitments and the preparedness for organisations to invest in what's really important. And it may be small to start with, but there's quite a lot of residual benefit to opening up the balance between how a workplace looks after all forms of equity. And a good example is the parental leave, where in a lot of organisations still there is only a primary carer leave granted, but by granting it for both carers, it provides an opportunity for, in a lot of cases, the maternal mother to return to work earlier with the support of having a secondary carer leave available. So it's not just about, in my case, it was being able to take leave as a male, but actually being able to take leave as a male and supporting my wife throughout that process. There's another component to this, which Ali mentioned, having unidentified CVs. There's also some really good technology that can be utilised in organisations now, which removes a number of biases, not just male, but also cultural, country of origin, even English as a barrier. Whilst I was at Medibank, we implemented a very clever system called Sapia AI, which actually removes the majority of biases in submissions to the point where you are seeing candidates being based on their values, behaviours, attitudes, and the alignment to the role very objectively, without some of those biases creeping in. So there can be a mix of different tools and approaches in that space. But I would say far and above that cultural and bias and gender equity training can be some of the most powerful tools for an organisation to implement. So in a slightly ironic way, unconscious bias, you can be conscious of when that's happening. And it's important for leaders to understand how to identify that, not just for themselves, but for their teams as well. And it's really important for organisations, I think, to proactively invest in ways to get better results and really commit to it through the tools that are available, because there are quite a number of support mechanisms out there, particularly in the recruitment process, that can make the balance of equity across an organisation so much easier down the track.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, sharing that, Jeremy. And Anne, what are your thoughts on this?
I've got a few thoughts on it, Lisa. I think talking about with Brett's example, for instance, that all-male panel, that sometimes I don't think we think enough about how we constitute a panel for interviewing prospective new people in our organisations. And fortunately, I've been able to be a mentor in the Business in Heels program in Geelong. And I remember, it was probably about 12 months ago now, one of the mentees wanted to talk to me about this exact point. She had gone for a role within her organisation. The panel was all men, and the organisation was predominantly men. She didn't get the job. Whether she didn't get the job because she wasn't the right person for the job, for her to be put in that position where in a male-dominated workplace with all males on the interview panel deflated her, and she felt that she was not going to be successful anyway. So I think that's a really important point. And I think there's also an unconscious bias still exists, that there are certain roles for men and certain roles for women. Obviously, that's changed a lot. And I remember, and this was a while ago too, hearing about, those monster trucks in the mines in Western Australia, where it was predominantly men driving these trucks. And when women first came in and were given those roles, it was, how can a woman possibly drive one of these big monster trucks? If anyone's been up that way, there's a lot of women driving those trucks now and doing it very well. So I think it's breaking down that unconscious bias and saying it should be the best person for the role, not whether it's a man or a woman or somebody who's gender diverse. It's on merit as opposed to gender. So.
That's fabulous. Thanks, Anne, for sharing that. And just some of this information that I've heard coming out of the tech industry, where they're really struggling to get women into the industry. One of the challenges, which I think Brett would have faced, is that quite often in having experts to review the decision, they're people with experience, and a lot of the people with experience are, historically people that are probably men in male-dominated industries. And so how do you get that sort of balance to the table? And some of the things that they've been trying to do in the tech industry is really adjust the initial panels and a lot of the work through, just to get even some of the shyer girls to the table to actually sit through an interview, because a lot of them were leaving in tears. So it's an interesting space, and I don't think anyone's got all the answers, but I think we've touched on some really great ways that people can change up their recruitment process and think about it a bit. Brett, was there anything else you wanted to share on that you've learnt as time's gone on?
Yeah, I think the important thing, there's some really great points that you've made there, Lisa, as well, about the composition of panel, as Anna said too. But equally, probably the other point I'd want to make is that this is occurring at a very senior level in an organisation. You're getting up into the sort of shareholder level for decision making, and so often there's an assumption that the further up you go in the hierarchy within an organisation, the more progressive, if you like, and the more contemporary the thinking might be. And that's an assumption that you really need to be quite guarded against. And so from my perspective, the core lesson from that was really, touch on Jeremy's point as well, is around, you need to make sure that there's real awareness around unconscious bias, regardless of the level that you're operating at, because you have all these great processes in place that get you to that point of a decision that actually are aligned with the organisation's objectives, and you're picking the best person, but you can fall at the last hurdle if you haven't thought that process all the way through to the end. And perhaps in my case, made the assumption that, well, we're all senior leaders, we know what our objectives are. But again, that unconscious bias, can often be strengthened, to your point, Lisa, the higher up you go into those areas as well. So that's probably the main thing that I would just want to emphasise, the takeaways, plan all the way through to the end in that regard.
Yeah, some really great points and a great discussion. So let's continue and explore the assumptions that can happen based on parental status. Now, Anne, you have experienced and witnessed this from numerous perspectives. Do you want to share with us your story?
Yeah, I was a very mature age law graduate. I was 46 when I finished my law degree. My children were all adults. The youngest was 18, so just an adult. And one of the interviews that I went for, I was asked a number of questions. One of them was, how many children did I have? I mean, I hope that would not be a question that would be asked today, but maybe it is still. I just wonder whether a man would have been asked that question, and whether that question was asked to gauge whether, not knowing how old my children were, whether having children impacts on your ability to, if a child's sick, whether you're the person who has to stay home with them, doing those normal primary carer roles. And I like to think that was 19 years ago. I'd like to think that now that has changed, but I have a couple of extended family members, one who have witnessed this firsthand, the parental status question firsthand. One was about 5 months pregnant when she went to apply for a role. The contract had ended. She'd been in the role for 2 years and they were re-advertising it. She was 5 months pregnant. She was unsuccessful in getting the role. And this was only a few years ago. When she came back from parental leave, she was approached and asked would she go into the role that she was previously in and not successful in getting, because the person they chose didn't work out. So, whilst they wouldn't have used necessarily her pregnancy as a reason to not give her the role, from her perspective, she saw that was the reason, and there could have been unconscious bias. Is there unconscious bias around? And we used to hear it said years ago, if somebody's in their 30s, a woman, well, maybe she'll go and have children. They wouldn't be thinking the same thing for a man. But on another hand, another extended family member, a male, applied for a part-time job in the public service. He was asked what he was going to be doing. It was a 3-day-a-week role. He was asked what he was doing on the other 2 days. Conversely, a woman would probably not be asked that, especially if she had children, because maybe she's the primary carer and she wanted to, work part-time. So it sort of works both ways, I think. And I think it's great. At Culture Legal, we don't have a primary and secondary carer as far as parental leave goes. And I think everybody's spoken, Jeremy certainly spoke about that. The ability for a father to stay home for the 18 weeks that we give in parental leave is hugely important. And I think it's it's just something that should be across the board. The other thing is, the expectation that the primary carer will be the one who cares for children when they're sick and, do that sort of primary caring role. We need to shift away from that, and we need to be encouraging men and women to be free to take that leave if they want to, rather than it being, oh, well, it should be the primary carer's role. So I think we've got a lot of work to do in that space as well. And it's another a really important area that we need to keep working on.
Fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. And Jeremy, what thoughts do you have about this? Have you witnessed similar biases?
Yeah, I have, Lisa. Just to put a slightly positive spin on it, though, I think the more we can role model and champion the behaviours that Anne has just mentioned, the better, because they're practical examples of what can work. There are plenty of times that people in life have got not just children that are sick, but it might be relatives or, requiring to care for others in different circumstances. And I think it's just breaking down some of those barriers and not being ashamed that you may need to put your hand up and say, do you know what, this is the time I need to take off. I think if we're in a position moving forward where even the discussion as to whether it is child-based or carer-based is going to be a good thing, that those discussions are broken down and we can support leave of any type for anybody. But there are certainly a lot of stories, I think, that to be shared so that we can role model and champion the ability for organisations to realise that if there's leave required at certain points in time, majority of the time it's actually a positive experience at the other end. I've been fortunate enough to take large chunks of leave, but I've also had a transition back to work scenario for our most recent child, where following a period of time off after our third child was born, I only worked for firstly 2 days a week for a period of time, and then 3, and then 4, and then went back full time, just so that transition was a little bit easier for the family. So being able to champion those success stories and sharing them with businesses so that they retain all of the benefits of having people with happy lives and happy well-being, and making sure that the IP stays in businesses and that we're supporting families and being good humans, I think is probably the more successful outcome than worrying too much about whether or not productivity is going to dip slightly or something may happen. So look, I'm a relatively optimistic person, and I think that there's more good news that we can spread to help guide this, as opposed to calling out the wrongdoing. But we also need to make sure, and this is where I probably come in, that I've got a privilege to have this very large platform to business and to leaders and to the community to be able to bring these stories through. And I love hearing about organisations who have got new and different ways of being able to support their employees of any type through these scenarios, so that there's parity and equity amongst the entire business.
Fabulous. Thanks, Jeremy. And Ali, what are your thoughts?
Oh, look, I think, modelling is incredibly important. And I suppose sometimes there might be people out there looking inwards and saying, well, it's it's much easier for a public sector agency to do that modelling. But I also think as a public sector agency, we've got a responsibility to our community because we're here for our community. So one of the things that we do at the city is we recognise that women in Australia over the age of 60 are more likely to become homeless than any other cohort. So we also recognise that because situations happen to women often later in life, whether it be a change in circumstance, separation, divorce. They may not have been in the workforce because they've taken out time to have children, so they do not have the superannuation buffer, and sometimes there is no superannuation. So what we do, and it's significant and would love others to go better. We love to lead at the City of Greater Geelong, but we also love it when we're outpaced because it sets the challenge and the bar for us even more, is that we pay 1 year's superannuation regardless of gender after the birth of a child. So that buffer for super, and it's generally still women who take that time off, means that supports them throughout their careers and once they're out of the workforce as well. So we really do like to lean into the key issues that are not only impacting our employees, but very much so members of our community as well.
Fabulous. Thank you, Ali. And Brett, what are your thoughts around parental status and these questions?
Look, I think normalising different carer roles and arrangements is one of the more critical aspects that's going to underpin, improving gender equality, to be honest with you, because it's such a common thing to hear these stories where, someone will be travelling interstate and the first question they'll be asked, if they're a woman, is, okay, who's looking after the kids? Or if they're at an event or something like that, what are you doing with the kids tonight? And those same questions don't get asked, obviously from a man's perspective. So this is one of those ones that's quite insidious because it seems like quite a small, minor thing in conversation that comes up quite regularly. But really it is just a reflection of these expectations that are often there, particularly for women around, well, that's part of your role, isn't it? And so whilst you can certainly address that from a policy perspective, you can certainly encourage that in terms of making sure that there's things available so that, more men can be involved in those roles. I think it's the day-to-day conversation, the way that you talk about it, particularly as a leader, is really critical to starting to shift the dial on that. But I think that's still one of the biggest issues that we have, and it remains one of the bigger barriers, I think, to really achieving gender equity.
That's a really important point, Brett. I think, it just continues to undermine women's position and is just something that is often not asked of other people. Now, there was an interesting question that got put in here, which I just think is relevant for the moment. So I often wonder how we support those who come in as the first woman or man into an environment where it's dominated by the other gender. And if people, as Ali mentioned, health's very female dominated, the ports, Brett, are very male dominated, the first person that, how have people tried to integrate? And it would be similar, I'm sure, if we added the intersectional characteristics of First Nations people or different ethnicities and things. So has anyone got any great ways to handle this?
I've certainly got one in our depots. So we don't recruit, if we can avoid it, one woman into a role. We buddy them. So when we go out and we recruit and we place women so that they've at least got another female into the role as well, and generally starting at the same time, and make sure that there's the supports and connections with people and culture, so that there's regular check-ins and that they've got really good supervision in terms of line managers as well that are supportive. And we also make it really clear that we do not stand for behaviour that is misogynistic, and we come down really hard. And so we have done that, and we make no apologies for that. So there is no place for anybody at the City of Greater Geelong who holds those behaviours, and we move very quickly. That said, we also recognise that we have an ageing workplace, and there's people and behaviours that would have been considered acceptable when they started at the city maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So part of our responsibility is through that learning and development and supporting the whole of the workforce to understand and appreciate what is acceptable and what we expect at the City of Greater Geelong. So everybody comes to the city, feels supported, feels included, and at the end of the day that they go home feeling like they've done a great job and want to come back next day to work. So
awesome. Sounds like a great place to work. Any other thoughts? I like the buddy principle. That's a really good way of making sure people don't feel isolated. Is there any other thoughts on that comment? No? Moving on, we'll move along. So let's consider another topic. Language use in performance reviews can be really pivotal in how people feel about their job. And as Ali's mentioned, people come to it because they want to feel like they're doing a good job. So Jeremy, do you want to share with us your story on this?
I will. Thank you, Lisa. I won't disclose the workplace or the time this occurred for obvious reasons, but I think this is worth sharing just as a trend that others may have experienced, where we were conducting 360-degree performance reviews. So I was the additional stakeholder, not the people leader or driving the particular performance review, but there were 4 males in the team and 1 female. And the performance reviews are typically aligned with performance criteria. So you have a set format that you follow, and you talk about what's working well and what's not, what some of the areas for improvement are. And for the 4 male employees at the time, that was a pretty straight conversation in terms of objective discussion and feedback and so on and so forth. However, when it came to the female one, and as an observer at the time, I felt slightly powerless about this until after it had occurred. But a lot of the conversation was steered away from some of the objective language, things about performance and metrics and activity and output, and steered more into some of the behavioural and attitudes and emotional language, which seemingly was quite biased towards this particular female employee. And it was, in hindsight, it was quite concerning because the objective component was zipped through, but there was this quite intense conversation about how certain assumptions and attitudes and behaviors, and using emotional language like appearing to be emotional and sometimes being upset would disrupt the productivity of the other team members. This was really only focused on the one employee. And as we know, that's not a gender thing. I get pretty emotional myself, and I'm sure everybody on this call and in many workplaces does, but it wasn't called out for the male employees. And so the discussion was had afterwards that the alignment on that was not right. But unfortunately for that employee, they experienced something that was quite different, and I would say quite unfair. Further down in my career, it's something that I simply wouldn't tolerate. But at the time, even just being partisan to that and now reflecting on it, that was quite a challenging and somewhat disappointing experience for me to have been involved in that, and something that I didn't necessarily realize at the time. I can learn from that, but it's also important that we champion that type of behavior and bias and unfairness just should not happen.
That's good to hear, Jeremy. Now, Ali, you've got a similar story, so I guess would now be a good time for you to share your story, because they kind of, it will add to the
look,
context.
I've been given a lot of personal feedback and still get quite personal feedback that's gendered and often just unsolicited. But when I was, I suppose, first thinking about applying for positions of senior leadership in local government, I was told I needed to work on my voice and lower it. And I was also told that I have an upward inflection. So it sounds like I'm asking a question, and that's not professional. And we know just the way voices of women, many women have upward inflections. So, but what did I do? I worked on that. So I knew at interview I was very conscious to lower my voice, and I spoke in a lower voice, and I was very mindful of my upward inflection. I know it creeps in. So that was a change that I had to make. Throughout my career as well, and what I still witness is an opportunity to be mentored but not promoted. So women are, in general, I believe, over-mentored and under-promoted. So part of, again, being in a position of leadership is really flipping that and really questioning it. Well, actually, does the woman need to be mentored, or does she need an opportunity actually to show what she can do and to create those opportunities and to actively create them, which also means to have the conversations about what roles can be split as well. So you demonstrate that if a woman wants to work part-time, and also a man, that there's leadership opportunities for part-time roles to be held at senior leadership roles as well is really, really, really important. So yeah, I'm sure there's many people listening into this call who could relate on that, you know, mentoring, offering, and also you just need to show more confidence, but that's sometimes not that helpful, and just the opportunity to actually show that you can do the job is incredibly important.
It's interesting, Ali, because we've seen a real trend to move to sponsorship as the next way to actually actively promote women in leadership, as opposed to mentoring. Each one has a place, but sponsorship's about creating those opportunities, which I think is quite important. But also touching on both the language use and this desire to share advice. Brett, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think there's some fantastic points there, and you know, I'm not surprised to hear those kind of examples, to be honest with you. I think, you know, there's a real consistency issue with, you know, how those conversations are often held within organisations, and you do see these completely varied ways of approaching people based on perhaps how they identify their gender or other sort of diverse requirements as well, whether that be age or otherwise. You know, from my perspective, I think there's probably 2 points I'd make about that. You know, the first one being that I think you need to be quite, you know, intentional with your design around obviously process and those elements and who you're sort of putting into, you know, decision-making positions, and how you set up your programs in that regard. But the second thing is, and this is really important, is that you do actually also need to capture those opportunities when they arise. And what I mean by that is, you know, these are real opportunities for learning for the organisation and for the people involved. It's not a case of sort of trying to craft a sort of gotcha moment where someone has used the wrong language in a particular, you know, conversation, but it is a case of saying, well, look, okay, let's actually just pause for a second and see how that actually went, and you know, why are we talking about this person in this way, but we're not talking about it in that way for this other person. And so there's got to be that kind of loop that you build within your organisation, within your business, to make sure that you're not just simply taking a, I guess, more of a judgmental approach to that. You're taking a coaching approach, and you're saying to them, look, you know what, the way that we handled that wasn't great. This is how that person's been impacted. What are we going to actually do about that? If you can build a bit of a feedback loop around that, you'll start to evolve your policies, you'll start to evolve your culture, you'll actually start to make some progress in that regard, and actually bring people along. I think that's the important part of that. You want to coach people and bring people along, because they're often completely unaware of how their bias is actually creeping in to how they're conducting themselves.
Yeah, some great points there. Anne, what are your thoughts?
I've got a couple of thoughts, Lisa, around, especially at performance review. There should be very clear criteria about what forms part of that performance review. And I think with the Jeremy's example, it blurred into a characteristics review, if you want to call it that. So it wasn't looking at the person's performance or their development. It was more learning, more focused subjectively rather than objectively on their characteristics. And I think if somebody is displaying behaviours that are contrary to the, to the values of the organisation, they should be addressed separately. Rather, if you've got somebody who's creating havoc or in the organisation because they're running around being angry every day, or they're, grumpy, etc., you might want to discuss that with them, or with the team, or someone from the team discuss it with them, rather than waiting for a performance review, which should be around the way they're performing, rather than focusing on their characteristics. So I think it's the way we do things and the way we address behaviours, because yes, if different people in our teams display different characteristics. We're all human, we're all different. If something makes us happy, we laugh. If something makes us sad, what's wrong with crying? We have to accept people for who they are, as long as they fit within the organisation. And if they don't because of their behaviours, that should be addressed. It should be picked up and addressed when it's noticed, if it's impacting the business.
Absolutely. Some great points there, Anne. Jeremy, was there anything else you wanted to add to that story?
I think just to flow on from Anne's comments, that's the starting component of diversity as well, right? That we're not all robotically working on objective performance metrics, but you bring in these other elements of characteristics and traits and behaviors, and you allow people to be themselves in different environments, which just enriches cultures. And that in itself can be a really good breaking of barriers to show some of those more human characteristic traits, which then gets people thinking more about the people they're looking after, more so than necessarily the policies, perhaps that they're creating them and hiring them and managing them to.
Yeah. And just to, does anybody else have any other key points that they want to share before we wrap up the webinar?
Been a great conversation and an absolute delight to be here. So
thanks, Ali. I need to share with you all that I was given feedback early on in my professional career that I wasn't professional unless I was wearing heels. Now, whether that's translated into business and heels in the longer run, I don't know. But I had to wear stockings and heels to be on a job on my feet all day long. So go figure.
I would just add, Lisa, that we should stay passionate, stay committed, and look for ways that we can continue to improve gender equity, because we're not there yet. We're getting there, but we're not there yet.
Absolutely. And I think the intersectionality category that we're working on for this year's awards is very, very interesting. And we're finally seeing that when people are treated as people and respected as people, whoever they are, and supported, the organisations are getting the best out of their people, which is fabulous. So, Brett, did you have any final words to say?
Oh, look, just a big thank you to all the panellists as well in relation to that. You always get a lot of value from these things, and it is a bit of a collective journey where you do want to share your ideas and really encourage people to reach out to other members of your community and business community about their experiences, because that's some of the best ways that you can get ideas for addressing gender equity.
Yes, exactly. So what a fabulous discussion. You've learned a great deal about why communication bias continues in the workplace, and some simple roadmaps on that you can implement into your workplace. If any of you want to consider being recognised as a male ally or as a gender advocate, please get in touch with me directly. We've got loads of best practices, tools and roadmaps that you can have a look at. And a huge thank you to our panellists sharing their experience and ideas, to Ali Wastie, Jeremy Crawford, Brett Winter and Anne O'Loughlin. Thank you. And that is a wrap.